Jeff York of the Establishing Shot, welcome to this hopefully a very fun conversation about a very important movie to me, Hollywood Shuffle by Robert Townsend. Criterion just put out, actually today, Tuesday, a new Blu-ray version of the film with a bunch of extra things on it. And it's great to go back and revisit a movie every few years, which I've done with this film. I did a written review of it about 5 years ago. And now watching it again, it's strange that even though I saw something within the relatively recent term of 5 years, I still found myself reacting differently emotionally, even to some of the humor than I did, just again a few years ago. Like a film that still manages to surprise me with its inventiveness and its heart. Let's talk about Hollywood Shuffle, and I want to begin with asking: A, how you doing? B,
I'm doing well.
how did you first experience Hollywood Shuffle?
I saw it in the theater. I think it was at the old Chestnut Street Theater that they used to have. Do you remember that? It was, I think, six rather small theaters over on, I want to say, basically State and Chestnut. It was a surprisingly mixed audience. I was a little wondering if you sort of the typical white audience would go out to them. But at that time, they were seeing all kinds of movies. So it wasn't really a huge concern or any kind of fear in any way at all. But, it was a very crowded theater, a very mixed crowd. Ages too, women and female, and everybody was really laughing. I mean, I think there was some laughter that was uncomfortable because it's like, wow, he's going there, and boy, did he really slam this and slam that. But I remember really laughing, and it's funny because I have always thought back into this movie because I think it was one of those that sort of is forgotten as a trendsetter in Hollywood. I mean, there's so many movies that we say, well, this Halloween started the slasher films, and this kind of film started that, and blah 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 blah. But this film really sort of opened up, I think, not only sort of a lot of the awareness of Black filmmakers and Black talent, but also how they perceive Hollywood's perception of them, and some of the satirical kinds of things that came from that. I mean, In Living Color, I think, is the biggest one that came out of this a few years later with one of the screenwriters here. Keenan and was one of the writers on this, along with Robert Townsend. So, it was interesting to see this and just think of that all again, because, Keenan Ivory Wayans, I think, he started his show, and I think his brothers started their movies, and there's a lot of things that started to sort of get into the, let's make fun of how Hollywood sort of views the Black experience. And, we get to the point where we have Black Dynamite and all these kind of things that came out from this, even to the point where Black Dynamite is a cartoon. I think that was on HBO or one of those Netflix, maybe, for a few years back in the day. But I mean, really, Hollywood Shuffle was kind of setting a course for some of this sort of Black satire and sort of taking the piss out of Hollywood's take on the African-American experience, let alone African-American actors and the talents that they have.
Yeah, I mean, my experience of it was a bit different. I mean, I was 10 when this
Uh,
movie came out.
oh,
And
you
I know.
son. So back in the day when I was barely in college then.
Well, no,
How
it's
old
it's
is
that
he?
this is just to say that it was a very formative movie for me in a lot of ways.
Sure.
I think I had seen some Siskel and Ebert, so when they do the sneaking in the movies parody in
Yes.
this film, I kind of recognize what they were going for.
Right.
But in terms of critiquing movies from a certain like cultural point of view, it got me thinking about, different people's experiences of the art that they are presented with. And it's okay to say, yeah, this doesn't speak to me, and this is dumb, and this is patronizing. Everybody out there who's been watching the channel, feel free to take a shot, because I'm about to mention that my father, when he was alive, he was Black. So I am the product of a mixed race marriage. And my dad was very much into trying to expose me to films and TV of from Black culture, and this was right in his wheelhouse. So, in addition to all of that, it was the first movie that my parents had to kick me out of the room because I wouldn't stop laughing. I mean, I'm 10 years old. This is probably one of the most profane and outlandish things that I'd, ever seen in terms of like the stereotyping, and just the, as you kind of mentioned, audiences watching this in the theater saying, can he say that? Can he go there? So they threw me out after about a half hour. They sent me up to bed, and I had to go downstairs the next morning and watch it, quietly trying to keep the laughter in while they were sleeping because we had to return the videotape that day or something like that. And it really, kind of changed my life in a way. And I think it was later that year I got my first issue of Mad Magazine.
Mm,
So Robert Townsend and Keenan Ivory Wayans kind of blew open the door to satire. Like, what is, satire and spoofing? And later, we were big fans of In Living Color, which you mentioned, which launched, helped launch the career of Jim Carrey, which is its own trajectory. But then later on after that, as you mentioned, the Wayans family, they came out with Scary Movie, which
right.
ironically, they sort of branched out from doing, so-called like black culture and commentary and satire to just satirizing mainstream Hollywood,
Mhm.
action and horror movies. And it wasn't really about a race thing at all. Kind of much like Townsend and Wayans did in this movie, proving that they didn't have to just stick to being a certain type of performer or doing certain types of parts. I think the Wayans family proved that they didn't just have to be one thing when they were doing these other kinds of movies. And then they had like, Townsend did like Meteor Man in in the mid 90s. And there was some kind of projects here and there that, some were hits and some were misses. But yeah, the impact of what they did as, mid 20s actors scraping together money in Hollywood, to tell the stories that they wanted to see, I think that's probably my biggest takeaway from that.
Well, it's interesting too, and I'll date myself because I can tell you that when I was your age and watching television in the 70s, um, there was,
When
obviously,
when when you were the age that I was when I saw this movie, not
yes,
not when
that's
you were
right.
my age now. I
That's right. That's right. I'm not that old, amazingly well preserved considering. Uh, And for me, as a young kid of 10 and sort of discovering all different kinds of things on television, it was a heady time because the 70s was the time of Norman Lear, of Roots, of a lot more of the expanded world of sports. So the idea that, middle America, that I was in a small town in Wisconsin, was unfamiliar with black people, was quickly becoming a misnomer. It wasn't true anymore because we saw them a lot, and their culture and shows about them, and et cetera, et cetera. Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte and different singers and performers, of course, all around the disco era, et cetera, et cetera. But it's interesting because I think one of the things that Norman Lear shows did is they started to examine the characters that blacks got put in. And a lot of times they were the same characters that Townsend is satirizing here, albeit with more depth and shading. But sometimes now when you look at some of the stuff from Norman Lear's years, as great and as revolutionary as all that was, it's like, wow, they were playing janitors and cops and the sort of stereotypical bus drivers, black roles, and nurses and housewives or maids or whatever like that. I mean, Florida was a maid on Maude. I mean, that kind of stuff was just, there you go, we're getting there but not quite. So watching this movie in the 80s, a good decade after a lot of that stuff was really becoming sort of considered to be very modern television, it was interesting to see there hadn't been a lot of change in that. And there were still issues with those roles being played by black actors, even if they were winning Emmys, even if they were great shows, even if they had a sort of progressive leaning into it, bent to it. It wasn't really coming quite as far as we'd hoped. And this movie and a lot of the stuff that Spike Lee did, and obviously some of the stuff that August Wilson was doing in theater, were really challenging a lot of those kind of things, saying it's not enough and we need to look at this and frankly be responsible for writing it ourselves. I mean, most of the people who wrote Good Times and the Jeffersons and stuff like that were veteran television writers from the 50s and 60s. Nothing wrong with that. They knew the world, they knew the world of sitcoms. But this kind of movie and this kind of decade was where they really started to say, we should be telling our own stories. We can play these characters and write them as well, if not more in depth, and give us a shot to sort of pull the reins.
Yeah, and for those who may be watching this and don't really know what Hollywood Shuffle is, I don't know why you would be doing that. But it's a comedy from 1987, as we mentioned, starring Robert Townsend as Robert Taylor, Bobby Taylor, who's a
Right.
struggling actor living out in Hollywood. He's gotten a couple of like TV parts, but he's mostly working at a fast food place called Winky Dinky Dog, and he's constantly ditching out of work to go on auditions, and he just has dreams of making it, but he's getting into his mid to late 20s, and he doesn't know if he's got what it takes. He's got a number of people. I mean, his family is pretty supportive. He lives with his mother and his younger brother and his grandmother, and they kind of believe in him as much as they can, but like his coworkers are constantly, no pun intended, dogging him, because winky dinky dog.
Right.
And other people in that he's auditioning with. I mean, it's a cutthroat kind of audition
Mhm.
process, of a lot of black actors vying for not very many roles, and certainly not
Right.
very many roles of substance. So we follow him as he goes through the process of trying to get the lead part in a movie called Jive Time Jimmy's Revenge. And the opening of the film is just a black screen, and we hear Bobby Taylor auditioning for this part as Jive Time Jimmy, who's upset that his brother has just been killed, or as he says it, killed. And it's just this stereotypical, horrible, like black, street pimp Hollywood dialogue. And as we come to see who Bobby Taylor is in his bathroom, like reading the lines with his little brother, and he stops this, jive talk to say, "I'm sorry, what was that line again?" And you realize that he is leaning into a part that is nothing like who he is or what he can do as an
Right.
actor.
Right.
And we get all these great fantasy sequences of him, as I mentioned. He is imagining, he and his friends are talking about movies that are coming out. They're like, "Oh, fuck the film critics. What do they know?" And so he and his friend imagine that they are sneaking in the movies, watching these blockbusters and giving kind of their real life, the street opinion of these movies. You get one of something that still just cracks me up and blows me away every time I see it. During the audition, one of the audition scenes, one of the guys next to him is saying, "How can you go in for these ridiculous, degrading parts? You should have more dignity. We can't be doing these roles. We can't be accepting these roles." And of course, his name gets called next. He's like, "I'm here," and he goes off to try and beg for the role, essentially. And at that point, Bobby has a fantasy about being a slave, being a butler during the slave era, a bunch of like runaways, and some of them want to go off, don't want to leave the plantation. There's the one guy who plays Mandingo, who's got a girlfriend, but he's also got a side piece, and then the master's wife wants to run away with him.
Yes.
And when Bobby pops up as the butler who doesn't want to leave the plantation, someone yells "cut," and all of a sudden he goes from being this like horrible, step and fetch it kind of accent to this very fine, proper British accent. He says, "Hi, I'm Robert Taylor, and I'm a black actor." And he goes into this commercial for black acting school where a bunch of white instructors are teaching black people how to act black and how to shuck and jive. And it's stuff that you think back to 1987. It's the kind of thing that you would have seen on edgy TV like 10 years ago. You don't associate this kind of like imaginative, ballsy commentary back then, but it's right there.
No, you're exactly right. And watching it again, I was sort of shocked at how relevant and ballsy it still would be today. And if, in fact, maybe some of that wouldn't quite make it today. I think, he would have been criticized for probably some of the gay stereotyping and even arguably some of the lack of women roles kind of in this. It is very male centric in many respects.
Yeah.
And the female roles tend to be a little bit of the, for lack of a better term, cliche supporting kind, the wise old grandmother, the sort of no nonsense, no bullshit, decent girlfriend, and that's kind of about as far as it goes by and large. But what I loved about the movie, and why I think one of the reasons it's ballsy, would even be ballsy today, is it's working on a number of levels. The first thing is you've got an actor who's trying to make it in Hollywood. That's a interesting story right there. Then you have this man who is a black actor trying to make it, which is a whole much more complicated thing. And everybody keeps telling him to be more like Eddie Murphy, because of course Eddie Murphy was the big hot thing then, and ever since Sidney Poitier, he was the next thing. So we need another. Poitier was in the thing in the 60s. We need another Eddie Murphy in the 80s. So everybody, especially in comedy, was, can you be more like Eddie Murphy? It's like, well, if you can't get Eddie Murphy, then you get this guy, and if you can't get that guy, you get this guy. That, I mean, even Keenan talked about that, how, you know, one of the reasons he wanted to do the show is to show that black actors can be funny without imitating Eddie Murphy, as great as Eddie Murphy was. And then finally, I think that the film works as a sort of meta film, in the sense that it's not just a straight story of this actor trying to become something. It's all these little fantasy sequences and these opportunities for Robert Townsend to not only, again, sort of make fun of conventions of Hollywood, and, you know, how, you know, the British talk civilized. And of course we can't have that in a Butler in the Civil War period, and just the mix of that. But it's also his chance to show, I think, in some respects, show off, because he's showing how versatile an actor he is. He's very good at mimicking and imitating stuff. There's a part where he's doing a parody of Rambo called Rambro, and, you know, he's doing the face, the slow face, you know, and this guy's a very good mimic, as Keenan and all of his brothers, and God knows Jim Carrey is, I think, the only white male actor on that series for a
The token white, yes.
Right. Proved, as did all the wonderful women on that. Kim Wayans was an incredible actress, and I'm surprised she didn't do more after that. Maybe she didn't want to, but so it works on a number of levels. I mean, you're just getting this film about Hollywood, this film about being an actor, this film about black stereotypes, this film about lack of opportunities for black actors, and this kind of this expanded resume about Robert Townsend, showing how talented he is. And if I don't want to necessarily take it into a different direction, but I will just throw this off too. I did a little research myself, getting ready for this show. And of course, one of the big stories at the time, which was an incredible story, but of course, leave it to Hollywood and all the people writing about it to worry about the money. You know, they don't worry about the messaging or the fact that Townsend is incredibly talented and there's other people in it. It's funny. It's got that sort of Airplane or Kentucky Fried Movie vibe and all that kind of stuff to it, which is fantastic. No, they're talking about the fact that he financed the movie with his credit cards, and he got like 35 different credit cards. And I think he spent the limit on each of them to, you know, cough up 70 or 85 grand or whatever it was to make this. And I remember at the time, that was the main story that came out of it. Like, show us how you made this movie. I mean, even the trailer is all about that. So, you know, here's all these people in Hollywood who are seeing this. Wow, he's making fun of us. He's really giving it to us. He's really shoving it to the man. And oh my God, though, the main story is that he financed it with his credit cards. And that's a little disingenuous and talk about racial injustice. It's like, really? The color we're worried about now is green and not black? That's kind of typical Hollywood, but there you go.
Well, it's interesting. There's a bit more to that story.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with you, but it is, in a way, it's sort of cynical, but it's also it was a way to get more attention to this movie.
That's right.
Because the way Townsend tells it, he had $60,000 of his own money that he had gotten from basically saving everything. He had a few parts in some movies with some, you know, big co-stars. He was in a movie with Kevin Costner. He was in
I think he was in A Soldier's Story, wasn't he?
A Soldier Story, which you know was nominated for 4 Oscars. He was in Streets of Fire, one of my all-time favorite movies.
Yes, yes.
Along with Grand Bush. They were the two of the band members that kind of get picked up in the middle of this, you know, adventure, and they both show up in Hollywood Shuffle. But he had this money that he had scraped together, and he was able to film. The movie took like 2 years, I guess, to make, kind of off and on, because you know he's not doing this with a studio. He's basically doing it guerrilla style with Wayans and his friend and whoever can, you know, they can scrape together whenever they can get them.
Right.
But he ran out of money, and so he, as he said, he was doing some stand-up. He came back and he had all these credit card offers waiting on his doorstep. So he basically applied for all of them, maxed out all of them. And then when he finally sold the movie to Samuel Goldwyn, apparently Samuel Goldwyn Jr., who was running the studio, Townsend said, "Can I get the money now?" Because he had to pay off all of these credit cards.
These debts, and
well,
I don't want my credit rating to go down. Well, not that people worried about it then, but now they really worry about that.
Oh, I'm sure. But Goldwyn asked him, like, what's the hurry? And Townsend told him the whole credit card thing. He said, that's nuts, but we have to tell people about it.
Right.
Because that's a really, interesting way of saying, not only are we making a movie that people are, responding to and we're pretty confident is going to be a hit, but it was made in such an unconventional and fine. It was made unconventionally and financed unconventionally. And the thing that I'd never really thought about or even probably knew until listening to all this anecdote I got is from the Criterion episode of the Elvis Mitchell radio show or podcast that Townsend was on last year.
Oh, interesting.
Great conversation. But
Mhm.
I'd always thought of the credit card financing a movie thing in the context of it was Kevin Smith and doing Clerks, 10
Right.
years, or 8 years after Hollywood Shuffle.
Mhm.
Robert Rodriguez, I think, did something similar.
That's right.
So
El
you
Mariachi.
El Mariachi, right?
Mhm.
So you hear about, these kind of and
Gonzo
Tarantino.
filmmakers doing their own thing. Yep.
Right, and Tarantino, like, working the video store and kind of, like, making the movies when he could,
Mhm.
you get these popular narratives that help
Mhm.
sell these movies, and I don't know if it was a race thing or if it was just that there was such a gap between Townsend doing it and then this kind of, like, wave of other people getting a similar idea, but I thought, "Man, that's Kevin Smith was such a pioneer, Tarantino, financing a movie on credit cards." Turns out Townsend and his friends had done it, almost a decade earlier.
Right. Which is kind of funny that they've forgotten that, because I think one of the things that happened maybe in the 80s, and of course everybody in Hollywood has a short memory. They only remember what made money last month and then or last year, and then they probably move on. But to that point, the 80s was a time of really sort of independent films coming up and really getting going. Uh, I remember, I think it was the year before, if I'm not mistaken, where Sex Lies and Videotape with Steven Soderbergh broke through. And
That was '89. That was a little
Oh, that
bit
was
that was
89. Okay, well
yeah,
then I
yeah.
guess it's even, yeah, a little bit after. But I mean, there was the whole indie movement. I think Sundance and Redford, what he was doing, that was really starting to take a hold and defy the studio system, which I think had a long run. You couldn't really get it in unless you had nepotism or somehow had these, connections. And here are these independent filmmakers. This was all before anybody thought of screenplay contests or screenwriting classes. They maybe would have that in college at UCLA and USC and NYU. And that was about it, other than maybe, theater writing, where maybe they do a semester on screenwriting. So it was kind of in the air. I think everybody was talking about indie movies, but it's funny because this is definitely one of those, maybe not as remembered as strongly as some of the other ones, but definitely Spike Lee, Rodriguez, Smith, all those people you talked about, Redford and Sundance, it really started to say, hey, we don't have to do this within the Hollywood studio system. It's too big, it's too monolithic. This is an opportunity for younger talents. People would never get in those doors, never get past the Paramount gates. Otherwise, a chance to show us what they can do. And if they had to finance on their own or by hook or by crook, they did. And that becomes a great story. But it also goes hand in hand with a good movie that, wow, that was made outside the movie industry's typical channels. And all the more power to it.
Yeah, it's a movie about movies and kind of taking shots at the people who are pulling all the strings. I mean,
Right.
I
That's
think it's
right.
a testament that this movie got released because I could see someone easily just saying, screw you. Like who are you to try and, say this about us? Um, in terms of, could this movie be made today? Well, yes, in some ways, because as people have talked about, and I've talked about on this show, filmmaking has become so comparatively inexpensive that if you've
Mhm.
got a phone, which most of us have walking around,
Right.
you could look like the Florida Project, or you can shoot things on an
Mhm.
iPhone and get it into film festivals and get big projects and deals coming off of that. But and that's not to take anything away from what Townsend had done. I mean, he the the first part of Hollywood Shuffle when he filmed it, he was getting the ends of film film reels
Right, right,
from movies that he had worked on.
right,
Like Norman
right.
Jewison, who I think had done A Soldier Story,
That's
gave
correct.
him all of the ends, and he pieced
Mhm.
those together to create the film
Right.
reels that he shot Hollywood Shuffle on.
Better get it
But
one take, Robert.
right.
Because you don't have enough film for a second.
But in terms of and this kind of goes back to what the conversation was, or one of the conversations around race was in the 80s.
Mhm.
Um, you know, for as much as Townsend was making fun of the tropes that had gotten, Hollywood up to a certain point, things
Mhm.
were changing in the 80s. probably sort of while he was making this movie, so there
Sure.
might not have been time to incorporate it. I mean, because you had what Philip Michael Thomas was co-starring on Miami Vice,
Right.
with Don Johnson, and that show was like a cultural phenomenon.
Right.
1987 also, I think that was the year, is either 86 or 87. I know this is a taboo name to bring up, but Bill Cosby, The Cosby Show.
Right.
And then that led to A Different World, and both of those shows ran for a long time and presented very different aspirational viewpoints for Black Americans.
Sure.
Um, but as far as Cosby got into a lot of trouble years before he got into the big trouble, and this is sort of the thing that I think caught the public attention that led
Mhm.
to what was the comedian that called him out on stage that kind of led to these
Oh,
Hannibal Buress, right?
Hannibal Buress. Yeah, that's right.
Yes. So Hannibal Buress was making fun of Bill Cosby, I believe, because Cosby had said, he basically his pull up your pants, you know, get married before you have
Yeah,
kids,
he
that
started
kind of
giving
thing.
these kind of
Lectures.
speeches around condemning rap music and the whole sort of um, too cool for the room black culture that he felt was destroying families and raising young black men to be very anti-authority and scary and all those kind of things that he was, almost taking sort of the pages from a lot of the racist kind of dialogue that was out there in various circles and stuff, and suddenly saying that himself, which didn't endear him to a lot of people in the community.
I know, and that's the sort of the problem, and I'll get to that in a second. But
Sure.
as Cosby was saying this, Hannibal Buress was doing some stand up, and at one point he basically said, "You're a rapist, Bill Cosby," and people like
Right.
what? And that kind of I think caused people to kind of go to Google and look up
Yeah.
a lot of the stories that have been following him around for decades. But
Those who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, right?
right. But then that sort of I think it sort of aligns with Me Too, and now I think he's out now. He got sentenced, and
Yeah, that's right.
now he's walking around, and but
Supposedly
look,
doing the comeback tour. We'll see.
that'll be interesting. But no, and full disclosure, my godfather, Joe Williams, the jazz
The Joe
musician,
Williams. Wow.
yes, was actually on the Cosby Show,
That's
uh
right.
playing Claire Huxtable's dad.
That's right.
um it's a very weird experience. Uh, anyhow, my whole point about that circular line is that Robert Townsend, without coming out and directly saying it, was in a way talking the same along the same ideal lines as what Bill Cosby was saying,
Mhm.
sort of extrapolating that from culture and the way people were living their lives to the entertainment that was potentially influencing and teaching young black men how to behave, playing pimps, playing yeah, uneducated, like violent thugs. I know is a loaded term, but that's the kind of stuff that he was trying to avoid. And the Bobby Taylor character in Hollywood Shuffle was condemning, and ultimately he walked away from what could have been the lucrative movie career. Like people were saying, oh, this is going to launch you, this is going to be
Mhm.
huge.
Mhm.
It might have just been another modern black exploitation film, the reality of that world. But he gave that all up to go along with what his grandmother was saying, because she didn't like that the
Mhm.
roles that he was going up for. She was offended by it. And she's like, there's always honest work at the post office. The end of Hollywood Shuffle, he gets his big break, I guess,
Doing a
by doing a
public
post
service
office commercial. Yeah.
commercial. Yeah, that's right.
So
Well,
my
oh,
point
good.
is, like, that Cosby has been condemned
Mhm.
outside of the whole everything that he did or did not do, whatever, in his
Right.
past, the stuff he was convicted for. But he was, called a sellout, and who is he to lecture people? But I think he was critiquing, perhaps inartfully and perhaps a little bit too forcefully. That's an odd term to use in terms of Bill Cosby, but uh, problems that he saw with the generation that was and the generations that were coming up after him in terms of
Right.
the way they portrayed themselves, the way they wanted to see themselves portrayed. And I think Townsend and Cosby were oddly aligned in that respect.
It's it's a fine line sometimes between um you know assuming sort of the control of it, so it becomes their story, versus the typical white screenwriter's story or Hollywood mogul's kind of version of it, and what is a cliche or kind of dangerous. I mean, I think it's interesting when you think about 1987, that same year, Morgan Freeman became known and sort of a movie star to most audiences by the movie Street Smart, where he played a really threatening, tough pimp in it, one of the greatest villain roles probably on screen in that decade for sure. And he got an Oscar nomination for it and then kind of never looked back. I mean, he was a movie star in doing lead roles after that with Glory, and that begat Seven
in which he played a slave.
Right, right.
Yeah,
And, again, it's kind of roles, even Driving Miss Daisy. A lot of people criticize that movie as, going back to a time that we wanted to get past. And ironically, it beats out Do the Right Thing for best film that year, which I think Do the Right Thing was not even nominated that year. But as Spike Lee once said, every time somebody's driving somebody around, my movie loses out, just like when Green Book beat up Black Klansman a couple years ago. It's like, don't get in the car, Spike. But that's so sad and funny. I love the fact that he was able to sort of spin that and find that comparison. But here you have Street Smart, Morgan Freeman, who had done a number of things on Broadway. He had done theater and stuff, Shakespeare throughout the nation. He was in some great productions. He was on Electric Company for, I think, 4 or 5 seasons, and was part of the Children's Television Workshop start, which was incredible. And the role that bursts him through is, of course, him playing a pimp. However, it's a very well done role. It was a better written movie than most of the exploitation stuff from a lot of the 60s and some of those kind of things. But it is that fine line, because I think Townsend is even arguing that here, because he himself is showing how it's satirical and making fun of it, and yet he's also doing it because it's what's so recognizable to people, and he's using that as a touch point, because it is something that is unfortunately part of the Black experience in Hollywood, that they're forced to play these roles because that's all they're writing. And but it is ironic. And I think the other thing, if I dare say, and I don't want to necessarily get to this if it's too soon, but what I think is funny in watching this movie too, and I watched it not only just from my thoughts as a fan and a movie critic, but thinking about the audience and the world around us. And while a lot of our world has come very, very far, I mean, obviously we've had a Black president and all kinds of other things, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, we're repealing civil rights legislation and voters and legislation, making it tougher for people. And we had a president who was very open about calling names and not liking certain people of diversity and things like that. So some of these battles still are being fought that we thought were maybe won back in the day of Robert Townsend, and going after the Hollywood battle was his kind of hill. But it was ironic watching it today, thinking, I'm almost thinking you could make that movie today, and for some people that would still be an eye opener, even though by now a lot of that should be like, yeah, that's what it was like back then, and thank God it isn't that way now. But in certain places, we haven't progressed as far as we should.
Well, sure. I mean, that's a whole political argument, because
grant you,
I will. I mean, I'm going to disagree with you a bit on the legislation stuff and the voter stuff. I'm going to disagree with you a bit on Trump and how some of what he said was characterized. I mean, because if you look back on, Trump was basically a New York liberal up until he decided to run for president.
Right.
Yeah, the top rated show on television.
Right.
He had been hanging around with minorities and Black people and getting awards from Black, organizations for decades.
Was great friends with the Clintons. They were at his wedding.
Right. So I'm saying it's a bit more, I understand the criticism, but it's also, everything else is more, it's nuanced than that.
Right. But I guess what I'm saying, and not necessarily saying that he was, I mean, you could also point to the Central Park Five that he never let go of even after they were exonerated. So, and his father's history and stuff. But I take your point. What I think though is things that movies like this tried to get us away from talking about or saying or automatically defaulting to haven't necessarily gone away the way they should have, and seem to have for many decades after that. I think there's still a lot of the dog whistles. There's still a lot of the read between the lines rhetoric and attitudes that shows that while we've made miles and miles of movement and progression, it's not as always as much as we should have. or there's still some of these strains of that out there.
Yeah, I mean, and there's always going to be room to grow and to improve. And those critiques are not, limited to, one group or one race
Right,
or another. Like
exactly.
everyone,
Women's
everyone's got to.
films. I mean, how
Hmm?
about women's films and women's place in Hollywood? And some of that I think is not as progressive as it really should be by now either, considering we've talked about women's rights and everything like that since the 60s. I mean, Gloria Steinem is in her 80s now. It's like, why are we still arguing about a woman's right over her own body, or women as directors and getting their kind of fair shake and those kind of things in Hollywood?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you brought up, excuse me. Um, we were talking earlier about how this movie does, it's not that it is, misogynist or anything, but there are not a lot of great parts, or at least non-cliche parts for women in the film.
Right.
I would put that more as a function of, I mean, certainly we weren't as progressive minded back in the 80s as we are today, but
Right.
also it's not really about them. It's about,
Sure.
the experience of two young black male film, actors
Right.
turned filmmakers almost out of desperation,
Right.
because Townsend was not a filmmaker. He was an actor who
Right.
decided that no, there were no roads for me. I gotta pave my own. I gotta mix the cement and
Right.
build this fucker.
Yep.
So the fact that this is not about his, girlfriend, played wonderfully by Anne Marie Johnson, who
Yeah.
I think
Very
it was
good.
like right after this was on another show I grew up with. Like there's so many spider webs like shooting out from Hollywood Shuffle around it. Like What's
True.
Happening Now. I
That's
grew up
right.
watching What's Happening when I was a little kid, like on reruns. And yes, Rerun
Speaking
was
of
in the
reruns,
show. Yes.
hey Raj,
Oh God. Oh,
do
I
you know
just
who wrote
remember.
that theme song?
No, who?
Henry Mancini.
Really?
I think Henry Mancini wrote that theme song for What's Happening. I could be
Nair,
wrong.
nair, 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 nair,
There,
nair,
there,
da,
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 da, da.
da. Yeah.
Let me put it this
I
way: if he didn't, he recorded an album with it on there, because I remember I had some Henry Mancini albums and that was on it. But I think he did that theme. I could be wrong.
Wow. But yeah, but she was Anne Marie Johnson around
Yep,
the time of this
that's
movie
right.
would be on the sequel, like the kind of the sequel series, What's Happening Now, where Raj and Rerun and Dwayne are all kind of grown up. It's only a few years after I think
Right,
the show is
right.
on. Like, oh, we left them when they were 18 and now they're 25 or
That's right.
whatever.
That's right.
But I mean, for what she is in this movie, I mean, it's not a really deep part, but I think she makes the most of it, along with the
Right.
grandmother character. She is really the catalyst for Bobby Taylor realizing what he's doing with his life and the impact it's having on
Mhm.
her, because she kind of says, I don't like you playing these pimp parts. I can't remember if it was her idea to bring Bobby's younger brother to the set at the end when they're filming, or at least doing like a dress rehearsal of Drive Time
I think it
Jimmy's
was.
Revenge.
Yeah. Hmm.
But Bobby looks over and sees his younger brother when he's doing these, like the director actually calls cut at one point, because I think Bobby forgets one of his lines. He's getting distracted. And the guy's like, look, that's great. On this next take, can you stick your butt out more and kind of bug your eyes out and get
Right.
real,
Right.
real jivey, like really
Right.
black on this one?
Make it more black. That's the line they keep saying throughout this. Can you make it more black? Which is
Right.
what they were meaning. And they even explicitly say, stick your butt out more, pop your eyes out, all that kind of shit. Oh my God. When you
There's even
watch, it's like,
a
wow.
Well, there's even a fantasy sequence shortly before this where Bobby imagines himself getting, talk about a precursor. He gets canceled and protests outside his house, and the head of the NAACP, played by Paul Mooney, is like condemning him, and even his
Right.
girlfriend is like, "I think we should just kill him," and she gets out a gun, and it's like, "Is this the face he makes in bed?" And there's a poster of him doing
Oh,
like the bug-eyed thing, and
yeah. Yeah. It's really
I think
funny.
I think he says, "Well, sometimes I do," but at the end of the film, Grandma really is setting Bobby up to put up a mirror to who his audience is going to be,
Mhm.
not only in terms of who might just end up watching the movie, but who might be affected by it in a cultural kind of an identity level, and
Right.
that caused them to snap out and be like, I can't do this. There has to be something else I can do, even if it's working at the post office
Mhm.
or going for a commercial role. And I noticed at the end in that set, it was kind of a mixed crew, and they were all very supportive. Whereas the people in the, was it Tinseltown Pictures, I think, was the studio that he was working
Right,
for.
right.
They're mostly white people, and they don't give a crap about anybody who's in that audition room. You know, they're just cattle, they're product. It's
And
like
see
it's
what's
like a
funny
Hollywood
about
plantation.
right. And what's funny about that too is, of course, that's just a straight out satire on the way people are in Hollywood. I mean, it's not just black movies and auditioning actors for those kinds of films that they were making, that you see those people who don't care and they don't know what they're talking about, and they're rude and they're snide and worried about 100 other things while you're trying to get their attention and get your shot. So yeah, it works on that level too, which is just hilarious. But I love some of the deeper stuff that is going on here, not only with some of those things that you said, but there is that example of like, what are you leaving for the next generation? You know, like, well, I want to get my money, I want to get my thing here, but what are you doing for the next generation, whether that's directly your brother or your kid or whoever else follows you? And that's not just in Hollywood. I mean, I think that's about a lot of decisions that affect the world or affect potentially have these ripple effects, or things that we do now can last a lifetime, everlasting eternity, as I believe it was said in Gladiator. What we do in this lifetime, whatever. Thank you, Russell Crowe. Maybe cough before you deliver your next line. Get that phlegm out of your throat. Anyway, but that's what I like about it. I think there's so many different sort of planes that Townsend is working here very, very cleverly, and including that one. Like, at the end of the day, it isn't just about, hey, I'm an actor who wants a better chance and doesn't like these stereotypes. It's also, what is this saying to the people you have to sort of face, or maybe the next people are going to come up, and are you advancing the ball for them?
Yeah, I mean, there was a wonderful scene which, when I was talking earlier about how it was a different experience watching this now than it even was 5 years ago, I really keyed in on the scene where Bobby goes to visit his uncle Ray, who's got a barber shop, but
Right.
he was an aspiring, I think it was an aspiring singer who walked away from, like, it was at the precipice of what could have been a really good career, but
Right.
he started listening to all the voices of negativity. At
Right.
first, the ones around him, of the people in his community, kind of saying, "You're never going to make it. You know, who do you think you are to try and escape all this and go to Hollywood or whatever?"
Right.
And then he said something like, "Then those voices became the voice in my head, and then I couldn't hack it anymore. I
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
stopped. But you have to keep going because you've got something special, and you can't listen to all these other voices." Like, it's a great message about pursuing your dreams at all cost, especially, you know, that idea of perspective, because Uncle Ray was not, I didn't get the feeling he was that much older than Bobby, like maybe
Right. That's
20
right.
years, but you
Right.
get the feeling that that 20, the difference between 27 and 47 or 50 goes by in the blink of an eye. And you can either say, I fought for what I wanted to be and it just didn't work, versus I kind of tried and I gave up, and
Hmm.
I still have to get to age 50.
Hmm.
But what are those intervening years going to be like? Are they going to be struggle and possible reward, or, regret and mopping, cleaning up in a barber shop? Not that there's anything wrong with that, except that he may have deprived the world of, a fantastic singing voice.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting too to sort of almost add some depth or context to that as well. Some of the actors and the people in this movie are some comedians who didn't quite get to that A list, or weren't given the opportunities that they probably should have, as talented as they were. Again, it's so oftentimes about, luck and the right project, et cetera, et cetera. But um, it has a way of being about this, and then also being about that, because he's using a lot of the same ideas in his screenplay that are true of a large deal of that cast there, that is probably, the could have beens and the would have beens if things were different in Hollywood, or they had gotten a better decent chance. I would also argue that as successful as Robert Townsend has been behind the camera after that movie and some of the things that he starred in, and he's done a number of shows and certainly been a success story in Hollywood. It's funny how few of the actors, even to think about in Living Color and the Wayans brothers and stuff like that, they've all had their runs. And I grant you, the shelf life of any actor these days tends to be a little short. But at the same time, there's not a lot of those guys who, Robert Townsend could certainly be in front of the camera. He was good looking and had a lot of talent, stuff like that, but didn't become quite the star that maybe he could have been and stuff. Although, like I said, he's a big person producing, writing, creating shows and stuff behind it. Maybe he realized that was probably a better place to have a longer career, make more of an impact, be able to have control of the material. But as I watched this, I kept thinking about, like, there were people like Franklin Ajay in there, who was a comedian at the time and didn't quite get to that level of Eddie Murphy, Chris Rock, and stuff like that. And some of it is maybe because his delivery wasn't as edgy or whatever at the time, and maybe with Eddie Murphy opening the door for edgier stuff and Richard Pryor, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, it as you're watching this, you realize he's writing a story about the trouble of Black talent, and then he's also cast the film with Black talent who have had those exact experiences.
Well, that's true. I mean, I will say that the hit rate for people who have appeared in Hollywood Shuffle and some of the subsequent Wayans projects is pretty solid.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
not terrible, not bad at all.
um,
But at the same time, there's not a lot of those people who are as big as maybe, I mean, but go ahead.
well,
I'm sorry.
but I'm saying that is kind of true for Hollywood, though. I mean,
True.
how many like multi-million-dollar marquee name celebrities are there in Hollywood anymore?
Very few. You're right.
Maybe if you talk about in the last couple of decades, maybe 100, but you've got 100,000 probably at least in that town trying to be one of those 100. It's the
Yeah,
Pareto principle, right?
for
So
sure.
I guess and also it comes back to sort of what you were touching on. How many people wanted to be Eddie Murphy, or maybe they wanted the leg up, that foot in the door, so they could go produce, or
Right.
use that to just do their own kind of thing. I don't know what the stories are. It'd be fascinating to find out, but it is one of those things where Hollywood careers are so strange. Some people strike it big and then they fade away. Some people strike it big and then you see them just kind of doing bit parts for, several decades, becoming great character actors.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to say what happened. I will say one of the other, I guess the last anecdote that I'll share from that Elvis Mitchell interview was about Eddie Murphy. And it was sort of about Robert Townsend learning the meta narrative of the Uncle Ray's barbershop story,
Yeah.
which is the Eddie Murphy scene, which you alluded to earlier, where he's imagining going in for an audition because they need an Eddie Murphy type.
Yep.
And Bobby Taylor doesn't know what that means, but he shows up and there's all these people, some in blackface,
Yeah.
in the black leather jacket with
Yes.
the afro and
Yes.
doing the corny laugh and all that stuff. Eddie Murphy, Keenan Ivory Wayans, and Robert Townsend knew each other around this time,
Mm-hmm.
and they were kind of friendly. And Keenan was very wary about this scene because he didn't want to offend the great Eddie Murphy. But Eddie had heard about this movie through various circles. He's like, I got to see this film. So they had a private screening, showed up with his big entourage, and they were watching it. And then the Eddie Murphy scene came up, and apparently up until that point, everyone was like laughing their asses off. But when the Eddie Murphy scene came up, everyone went really quiet because it's Eddie Murphy's entourage. You don't want to be the one guy who's laughing and
Right.
Eddie Murphy's
Right.
offended and all that stuff. But
Right. Right.
apparently Eddie Murphy thought it was really funny. And Townsend went up to him after the screening, kind of apologized, like, look, I was just kind of taking the piss and I hope you weren't offended. And he's like, no, man, I love it. In fact, I'm getting ready to do this stand-up movie later this year. I think you'd be perfect for it. And that's how Robert Townsend not only directed
Raw.
Hollywood Shuffle in
Yeah.
1987,
But
Eddie Murphy's Raw.
that's right. That's right.
Biggest concert movie ever.
Yeah. And, it's funny. I think Eddie Murphy at that time was very well aware of his power and his stature. And I'm sure in some respects it was a compliment to be told, we want an Eddie Murphy type here. And he knows what he was doing to make people laugh, and his style and everything else. I mean, again, imitation is oftentimes the sincerest form of flattery, but he's held up as kind of the primo guy in this movie. So of course he's got to like that. And obviously as a comedian who took the piss out of everybody from Jackie Gleason to Bill Cosby and other people in Raw, I'm sure he can appreciate the fact that once you get to certain superstar status, they're going to come for you. At least if they do it, they're funny like Robert Townsend was.
But, and that's exactly right. But the reason I told that story is that Keenan Ivory Wayans, who co-wrote Hollywood Shuffle with Robert Townsend, ended
Right.
up being the kind of voice in Robert Townsend's head that other people were to Uncle Ray,
Yeah,
saying like, look, I know you really believe in this, but if you do this, it could really mess things up for us. We don't want to
right,
rock the boat. We don't want to take this chance because it could,
right.
destroy us before it makes us. And Townsend was like, I think it's going to work. And sure enough, it did. And it paid off in dividends in ways that if Townsend had listened to Keenan Ivory Wayans, Keenan Ivory Wayans might not have had the career that he had
You're
in certain
right. You're
respects.
right. Well, and I also think that, to your earlier allusion to Mad Magazine, I think since Mad Magazine, Saturday Night Live, the stuff that the Abrams and Zucker folks did with Airplane, we are now a world and certainly a nation, a youth market primed on satire. Stuff is made fun of almost as soon as, I mean, look at all the Wednesday dances that are all over TikTok. Those are essentially parodies. They're homages, but when you've got kids doing it and grandparents, I mean, they're all sort of satirizing it. Like, what would that look like? Oh, it's funny because an 8-year-old's doing it, or it's funny because a 4-year-old can do it. Wow, that's impressive. So I think, satire is now part of, it's baked into comedy and to be made fun of. I mean, look at the Super Bowl commercials. The Super Bowl commercials are all about making fun of celebrities and intellectual properties. There's very, very rarely truly novel, new kinds of thoughts there, because they don't have enough time. They don't have enough attention span from the audience. They've got to say, okay, we're going to do a Grease parody. Well, why are you using the guys from Scrubs? It doesn't matter if they're doing a song with John Travolta. Okay, I would have ixnayed that idea. Some other creative director out there said, no, that's brilliant. Let's do it. So I think Townsend and Keenan Ivory Wayans, and even to some degree, Eddie Murphy, when he's sitting there going, I've been watching you, Norton, and I've been watching you, watching me, watching you. Satire and sacred cows and going after your idols, it's all fair game and part of what we want, part of what we crave, part of what we expect.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because that's almost like an entire different discussion about how
Yeah.
satire has almost become a little bit too ubiquitous to the
Yes.
point where it's
It's
referencing
almost the
itself.
comedy. Yeah. It's almost
Right,
the comedy now. It's like, it's so meta. Like, it's comedy can't just be straightforward like a rom-com. It's almost got to be making fun of rom-coms.
right. Um, but it's interesting, like if you look at the satires that kind of make up the fantasy sequences in Hollywood Shuffle, a lot of it is sort of what I'll call Robert Townsend and Keenan Ivory Wayans' black takes on white popular culture,
True.
which a lot of people talk about, rightly or wrongly. I'm not going to judge anyone's experience, but you hear a lot of people saying like, when I grew up, like the actress who's playing the Little Mermaid, I'm blanking on her name.
Oh gosh, I'm blanking too.
Oh, it's
Sorry.
Haley Berry,
There you
right?
go.
Or
Yeah.
or Halle Bailey, I think it is.
Yes.
It's
I'm
very
looking
similar
it
to
up.
Halle
Keep
Berry,
talking. I'm looking it up for
right?
you.
But she had recently come out and said, like, I wish there had been, someone like me in this role when I was a kid, so black and brown children could see themselves in these parts. I mean, she's like 18 years old, so I don't exactly
Right.
know what that means. Like,
Right.
things have been moving in a very progressive direction in terms of entertainment for at least the last 20 years.
Right.
It's more of a talking point than I think anyone of her generation should be saying. People of like Townsend's generation, and perhaps a little bit younger than that, I think they've got more of a claim. But it's interesting that they're not talking about how like Casablanca was horribly racist or Superman was problematic because he was white. It was more that there are all different kinds of audiences who can resonate with these old films and TV shows, but there could also be a bit of a twist on that perspective that someone from a different background, a more diverse background, could bring to the material. Which I think
Yes.
is sort of a way that something that we're kind of seeing in some of these like recastings and reimaginings today, but Townsend was doing it, he was thinking along these lines 35 years ago.
Well, I think what you're pointing to is that maybe it isn't enough, even if it seems like it's a lot. And indeed, it is a lot more than it used to be. And you're right, it is Halle Bailey. I know it's so close to Halle Berry, but I'm sure maybe your parents wanted that. But I think maybe her point can be taken more than just a talking point, because I think Disney and the whole sort of animated world was a little slow in catching up to some of that. I mean, they had to do the frog princess to finally get a sort of black princess in front of kids, and there hasn't always been as much diversity in cartoons, though much more so than many years ago. Even though when I was a kid, they had Haji and Johnny Quest. So come on, I was a wee tot watching that in the late '60s. Come on, folks. But yeah, I think it's interesting. It probably can always be a little bit more, or and I think having to kind of go out of the way to do the different kinds of conscious casting. We haven't gotten to the point yet where it's kind of still not going to be noticed. It is going to be noticed. And I think one of the success points of Hamilton is because here's this story about America, and it was kind of colorblind. And it's supposed to be, the idea of America is supposed to be that, including the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence and all the things that Alexander Hamilton and the ilk did. However, not quite. And yet by doing it today with a, much more diverse audience than say did 1776 back in 69 on Broadway, it's making the point that in theory, this is where it should be. Maybe we're there today, maybe not, but by casting it that way, it adds an extra layer of thought to it, because it's like, are we as idealized as supposedly we think the founding fathers intended? No, we're not. But at the same time, we are moving quite a bit forward, and in many good ways. And this movie in 1987 was an amazing film, and it looks pretty amazing today. I'm also impressed by how good a director he was at that time, having not done he obviously has watched television and movies and knows where to put the camera and how to edit and build a scene and direct actors. But that was very well done here. I mean, I don't think his film looks amateurish in any way, other than you could say that some movies in the 80s had a certain look to them. The camera was still a little far back. Sometimes the lighting was a little flat. It wasn't quite as nuanced. I mean, goddamn, Gordon Willis was really onto something with his shadows in '72, and yet he couldn't get an Oscar nomination to save his life because he was from New York, and everybody thought he was putting too much darkness in the frame. It's like, that's what lighting looks like. It's not all overlit. Right. Townsend still kind of overlighting in that Universal Studios '70s kind of look here, which is also funny because a lot of times, modestly funded films tend to be overlit, and he was not only making one, but he was showing a movie that was being made that had that same kind of characteristic.
Well, I think that's sort of I think in a way that's sort of the genius of what he did here, was he was trying to make something that, even though it was scraped together on credit cards and, filmed on leftover bits of film,
Right.
He wanted to make something that was commercial, that would not be, to use an inartful term, ghettoized, to be like,
Right.
I think he kind of talks about this. He didn't want it to be a black film. He wanted to be seen as an independent film, which are two completely different things. Right. I think he succeeded great. And yeah, it's an older, movie. It's 35 years old, or 36 at this point, but you can watch it and it's got a really nice transfer. It looks crisp. It's bright. It's, colorful. It's inventive, because like when he's doing the Sam Ace, which is the sort of the Sam Spade takeoff, it goes to black and white and it's all grainy and it's got that kind of film noir thing to it. Yeah, it's a wonderful movie that I think gets better every time I watch it. And every time I watch it, I'm learning, I'm unlocking more about how I came to think about movies and cultural issues. And I'm also finding new ways to laugh and new ways to be kind of moved by it. Like I mentioned, the Uncle Ray sequence.
For sure. I also think, Ian, that one of the great things that he's telling us in this movie, and again, this is maybe another layer that it kind of works on, is that while we may think that whatever we conjure up in our heads as the Black community, or, where he came from in some of the past, their experience is often very similar to ours through the lens of the television and what movies and shows they're watching. They're watching a lot of the same things we are. So,
and that was what I was kind of getting at.
Yeah,
with,
Townsend
it's not
aware
like
of. Oh, good.
Well, I was going to say, like, he could have, his cultural touchstones, instead of like, a 1940s like white detective movie, could have been, frickin' Sanford and Son or In the Heat of the Night or something. But no, he's doing Superman and, Humphrey Bogart.
That's right. And I think to a large degree, everybody in America has that same experience through television. I think that television in some respects is a great equalizer in that we are all watching similar shows. We all have access to it, and we've grown up with those, whether, it's certain cartoon shows or certain shows that did not necessarily have enough representation in it. They're still affecting and interesting and entertaining to large amounts of audience out there, whether they're represented or not. It reminds me of, I used to be a creative director on toy accounts, and we did a number of focus groups and research and all that. And we found that young girls being brought up can relate to young boys as the lead character in books, in stories. They could read Huck Finn and relate to Huck Finn, even if it's a boy. They're not necessarily relating to Becky Thatcher, or they could watch, Dexter's Laboratory and identify more with Dexter than his bratty sister and things like that. Or, they would look at superheroes, the Power Rangers, whatever, and could like the Pink Ranger, but they could also identify with whatever problems were greeting the Green Ranger. Boys, not necessarily. Boys are a little spoiled. They can't necessarily relate to the female characters, but I guess what I'm saying is I think when you're part of the have-nots, sometimes with the people who aren't necessarily always seeing yourself in books, in shows, in culture, you find a way in, and the universal nature of their stories, whether it's a boy character or a female character, is relatable to most people. And that's one of the great things I think about this movie. It's not just Sanford Son. It's not just, sweet, badass, that kind of stuff that might be considered, they only related to the movies that they went to see in like Shaft and Superfly. It's like, no, they are far more, probably familiar with I Love Lucy or Humphrey Bogart than, the Van Peebles. I mean, I'm sorry, but they probably are, and that's because, Melvin Van Peebles movies didn't always come to our neighborhood, every neighborhood, where TV gets into every household in every corner of this country. So
Right, or even like mainstream Hollywood movies like, Jaws and Star Wars and stuff like that,
exactly,
right?
all that stuff is there and enjoyed by masses of audience, all four quadrants, all races, all sexes, all different people. So
Yeah. Wow, this was a much more robust conversation than I thought it was gonna be. Like we talked about Hollywood Shuffle. We also talked about a lot of other stuff, and I had a lot of fun. So I thank you, Jeff, for watching this again and for talking about it with me. I hope neither of us get canceled as a result of this.
You might have to go back and edit in case there's something we say that's too controversial. But no, I think it was a great movie to discuss because it's a great movie. It's a great comedy. It's a great comedy about Hollywood. And it also is a great comedy about a Black actor trying to get some attention in that town that at that point wasn't giving Black actors and people of diversity enough opportunity. So he made his own. That's 5 different layers you can appreciate this movie on. And you and I think, definitely appreciated on all those.
Yeah, and for anyone who's watching this, again, if you haven't seen it and you've made it all the way through the end of this episode, congratulations. But if you've never seen Hollywood Shuffle and you're one of those people, not to, generalize, but I know some folks are like, I don't want to watch anything that came out before the year 2000 because it's old and, it's not for me. This movie is 35 years old. I still think of 35-year-old movies as being like from the 50s because I'm developmentally arrested. But, it's one of those things I think you could put it on and just be surprised about how current and funny it is. You might not get all the references, like who the hell is, Sam Spade, but you're gonna get some of them. I think get a lot out of it in terms of the messages and just the talent that is just like all over the place. The one goof before I go is that I noticed when Bobby goes in for his first audition, they have a wide shot of all the people that are, in line in front of him because he's ditching from Winky Dinky Dog. It's 10:30 in the morning. He has to be back before the noon rush, and there's no way he's going to make it because there's this long line. One of the people in the audition seats is Dom Irera, who plays the white screenwriter of Jive Time Jimmy's Revenge,
funny.
who we see
Right,
a couple
that's
minutes
right.
later in the audition room with the other 2 people. He's wearing
It's
a different
like-
set of clothes, but it's almost like they took one of the outtakes or one of the establishing shots that he just happened to be there hanging
Yep.
out, and they put it in the movie.
He didn't have the film ends to go back and reshoot that.
That's right.
If
Damn
only Jewison had given me one more reel.
it.
Thanks, Norman. I appreciate all you did. However, one flaw.
Ruined the movie. No. All right, Jeff, thanks so much for talking about Hollywood Shuffle with me again. Folks, check out Jeff's stuff at The Establishing Shot. Not only a great critic, but also a tremendous artist. Did you ever do a caricature of like Robert Townsend or Hollywood Shuffle or anything like that?
I was not as prolific about doing caricatures back in those days, or if I did, I wasn't really necessarily doing movies. I was probably doing politicians or coworkers or things like that. But around the mid 90s, I started to really sort of get back into caricaturing again. So done a lot of them since, a lot of movies since then. Nothing of Townsend, but yeah, that's a good one. He would have been, he's got a good look to him. He would have been a good caricature. Handsome yet expressive and kind of funny too.
Oh yeah. Um, I hate the poster. Like there's this one poster for Hollywood Shuffle is just him and Anna Marie Johnson,
Oh yeah,
and it looks like it's some kind of a romantic comedy about
I
like,
know.
they met in a bookstore, and I don't know what's going on with this poster,
The
but
80s, as good as the 80s were, and I think they get knocked a lot as a decade for film because there's a lot of terrific movies in the 80s. I will say this: I think posters took a real step down from the 60s and 70s in the 80s. That's when I think, a lot of the montages started to come in there, or they would, have that sort of fuzzy image that they thought might be more appealing to everybody, like a romantic image when it's not really a romantic movie here and stuff like that. The 80s and 90s, I think movie posters left a lot to be desired, and it's kind of a lost art in some respects altogether. Now, I mean, I even get mad about the fact that most television shows don't have decent credit sequences anymore. It's like, where are the great theme songs? Come on. Usually it's like they have to scrape to come up with 5 really good ones for the Emmys each year. Like, really? That's a nominated theme song? What show is that? But anyway, yeah, the poster was maybe the only thing that I to your point, I didn't really like about this movie.
yeah. Well, movie posters are a dead art, I think, with some exceptions. But I mean, for me, like it peaked with the 1990 late 90s Star Wars reissues, where they actually got Drew Struzan to do,
Yes.
collage posters, but they're Drew Struzan collage posters, and they're works of art in and of themselves.
They are. And I'm going to just throw this in there because you and I are American Academy of Art alums, but we've talked about this a little bit. But one of the nice things about me preceding you in those decades is I grew up on Bob Peak and Richard Amsel and some of those kind of artists who were doing movie posters all the time, and incredible work. And when I show those to young people who are not familiar with them, and they generally say like, wow, I didn't realize movie posters could be illustrations. It's like, yes, yes, they can.
Oh,
It doesn't just have to be Photoshop.
we need a renaissance in the movie poster. I'm putting it out there. All right. I'm gonna get us out of here because we're gonna Hollywood shuffle along back to our respective evenings. Jeff, thanks so much again. Folks, check out Jeff's stuff again at The Establishing Shot. If you liked this content, please feel free to like and subscribe to Kicking the Seat. And if you're a fan of Hollywood Shuffle and Criterion, you can get the Blu-ray. It's out today. There's a bunch of extra features, and the transfer looks great. And yes, all hail Robert Townsend. This movie is a masterpiece. So Jeff, thanks a lot, and we'll catch you later.
Thank you, Anne.